Sloane wasn't losing her mind. She knew exactly where she had left her notes. Someone had moved them. Again. And the only new person in the house was a 16-year-old girl who smiled at all the right moments. Before anything changed, their life had the kind of quiet that does not feel empty but deliberately chosen, like a room arranged by someone who understands what silence can protect. Kieran and Sloane lived in a narrow townhouse in Portland with tall windows that caught the gray light in a way that made mornings feel like a soft continuation of night. Kieran worked as a furniture restorer, spending hours with old wood, sanding down surfaces that had survived decades of other people's lives. His hands were patient in a way that contrasted with the modern world around them. Sloane was a journalist specializing in investigative work, someone who lived inside patterns, contradictions, and truth that people tried to bury. She trusted evidence more than emotion, but with Kieran, she had learned a different kind of truth, one that didn't need proof to exist. Their relationship was built on absolute honesty, not the idealized kind people talk about in speeches, but something more practical and sometimes uncomfortable. They told each other things most couples would avoid. It made their bond stable, but also exposed every fault line clearly instead of hiding it under polite silence. They had learned to survive that transparency, and in a strange way, it made their intimacy sharper, more deliberate. Love between them was not loud. It was consistent, like a system that had been tested under pressure and still functioned. That morning, Kieran stood by the kitchen counter, his fingers stained faintly with wood polish, watching Sloane scroll through notes on her tablet. There was a calm familiarity between them, the kind that usually precedes ordinary conversations about schedules and deadlines. He didn't look tense, but there was something measured in his posture, as if he was preparing to shift the balance of their routine. Sloane noticed it immediately, because she always noticed changes before they were spoken. Kieran said it simply, without hesitation, as if he had already rehearsed the exact emotional weight of the sentence. He told her that Beatrice was coming back from her grandmother's home in England. 16 years old, his daughter, returning after a long stretch of absence shaped by distance and divorce. He didn't embellish it. He didn't need to. The information itself was already heavy. Sloane paused, then looked up from her screen. There was no visible resistance in her expression, only calculation and adjustment. She had read enough cases, interviewed enough fractured families, to understand what this meant before it even unfolded. A teenager returning after emotional displacement was never just a logistical event. It was a psychological reentry into a system that had already stabilized without her. "She'll stay here," Kieran added, more as confirmation than question. Sloane nodded. "Of course she will." There was no hesitation in her voice, and that mattered more than reassurance. She understood what acceptance required. Not optimism, but structural readiness. She didn't romanticize the idea of blended family dynamics, but she also didn't fear them. What she feared, if anything, was instability she couldn't map. Kieran walked closer, placing his hand briefly on the edge of the counter near her tablet. "She had a hard time with the divorce," he said quietly. "She doesn't talk much about it. Or about anything, really." Sloane finally closed her tablet. "Then we don't force her to talk. We let her arrive first." That was the agreement. Simple, almost clinical in its clarity. But underneath, it was something neither of them verbalized, the understanding that Beatrice would not be a neutral presence. She would enter their home carrying history, and history never arrives quietly. The townhouse itself had always felt like a space of controlled intimacy. 2 floors, narrow stairs, walls lined with books and restored furniture pieces that Kieran had worked on for months. Everything had a story, but nothing dominated the space. The narrow architecture meant that every footstep on the wooden stairs carried a specific resonance, a map of movement that made true privacy impossible. Silence here was not an absence of sound, but a shared awareness of who was occupying which floor at any given second. It was balanced, almost fragile in its equilibrium. Sloane sometimes thought of it as a system held together by mutual restraint. Kieran had built much of that atmosphere. Sloane had adapted to it, but she had also reinforced it in her own way, by keeping her investigative chaos contained within her work, never letting it spill too aggressively into their home. They had learned each other's boundaries with precision. And then Beatrice arrived. She did not enter like someone returning home. She entered like someone assessing a territory she already knew she would disrupt. 16 years old, carrying a suitcase that looked too structured for someone her age, her posture composed in a way that felt intentional rather than natural. There was a softness in her appearance that could have suggested vulnerability, but her eyes contradicted it immediately. They were observant, controlled, and almost too aware of the room she had stepped into. "Hi," Kieran said, stepping forward. Beatrice nodded slightly. "Hi." No emotion, no acceleration, no visible relief or discomfort. Just acknowledgement. Sloane stood a few steps behind Kieran, watching without intervening. She registered details the way she would during an interview. Tone, pacing, eye movement, spatial awareness. Beatrice did not look at her directly at first. That delay was noted. "This is Sloane," Kieran said gently. Beatrice turned her gaze toward her stepmother. A pause. Then a polite expression formed on her face, carefully assembled. "Nice to meet you." "Nice to meet you too," Sloane replied. The words were neutral, but the atmosphere between them was already not. Beatrice moved into the house with quiet precision. She did not rush, did not hesitate, did not explore openly. Instead, she observed as she went, as if cataloging each object. The vinyl record player she had brought was placed in her room without explanation. It was the only personal item she immediately prioritized. That evening, the house adjusted to her presence in small, almost invisible ways. The air felt slightly reorganized, as if the architecture of silence had shifted. Kieran tried to maintain normalcy, preparing dinner, asking simple questions. Beatrice responded politely but minimally. Sloane observed everything without interfering, understanding that early-stage integration always revealed itself through micro-behaviors rather than declarations. The first subtle disruption happened in the bathroom. Sloane noticed it before she understood it. Her perfume was gone. Not moved, not replaced, removed. The scent that had been part of the space was deliberately erased, as if someone had decided that presence itself needed correction. When she mentioned it casually to Kieran later, Beatrice was nearby, sitting at the table, eating quietly. She did not react. Not a flicker. Her expression was calm, almost angelic in its innocence. Sloane accepted the explanation without confrontation, not because she believed it, but because she was still collecting data. That night, after Beatrice went upstairs, Sloane stood in the dim kitchen light while Kieran washed dishes. The domestic rhythm between them continued, but it had a new layer now, one neither of them addressed directly. The presence of a third consciousness had altered the structure of their intimacy. "She's adjusting," Kieran said quietly. Sloane looked at him for a moment before responding. "Yes," she said. "She is." But what neither of them said out loud was that adjustment could take many forms. Some of them were invisible until they were already irreversible. And somewhere upstairs, behind a closed door, Beatrice played a vinyl record softly, as if marking her arrival not as a return, but as the beginning of something else entirely. Beatrice did not disrupt the house loudly. She changed it in a way that was almost surgical, removing small emotional anchors one by one, as if testing how much of a system could be altered without triggering immediate collapse. Her presence was quiet, but it was never passive. It had direction. On the second morning, Sloane woke up earlier than usual. The house was still, but something felt subtly misaligned. She found the bathroom already cleaned in a way that was too precise, too intentional. The air freshener she never used had been replaced with a neutral scent, erasing any trace of her personal routine. It was not vandalism. It was revision. Downstairs, Beatrice sat at the kitchen table with headphones on, listening to music through her vinyl setup. She looked calm, almost detached from the environment she was reshaping. Kieran was already awake, making coffee, trying to maintain the familiar rhythm of mornings. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked her gently. Beatrice nodded without removing her headphones. "Yes." That was the pattern. Minimal answers, no emotional hooks, nothing that could be used as leverage or connection. It was as if she had learned that emotional availability creates vulnerability, and she had chosen the opposite strategy. Sloane observed her from the doorway, noting how Beatrice's attention shifted briefly toward her, then away again. It was not avoidance. It was control. The first clear disruption came later that day. Sloane was preparing for a recorded interview, a sensitive piece involving corporate misconduct. The recording was stored on a portable device she kept in a locked drawer. When she opened it, everything appeared intact. But during playback, She heard only white noise. The device sat on the desk, but a powerful neodymium magnet from Kieran's workshop had been placed inches away from it, as if left there by accident. This wasn't a digital glitch. It was a physical erasure, staged to look like simple domestic carelessness. It had been introduced during a narrow time window when only 3 people had access to the space. Kieran was in the workshop downstairs. Sloane was in another room. Beatrice had been exploring the house. When she descended the stairs, she found Beatrice standing by the bookshelf. She wasn't just looking. She was tracing the seams where the old would met the new, her fingers lingering on the repairs with a cold, clinical curiosity. "Did you touch my recorder upstairs?" Sloane asked calmly. Beatrice turned her head slowly. "I don't think so." Not denial. Not confession. A careful ambiguity designed to leave no friction point. Kieran looked up from his workbench. "What happened?" "My interview file is corrupted," Sloane said. Beatrice tilted her head slightly, as if processing the information with interest. "That's unfortunate." There was no concern in her tone, only acknowledgement. Sloane did not push further. Not yet. She was not interested in confrontation without pattern recognition. 1 event meant nothing. 2 meant direction. By the 3rd day, the pattern expanded. Sloane noticed that her perfume in the bathroom had been replaced entirely with a neutral, almost clinical scent. Not just removed, overwritten. The change was subtle enough that Kieran would not have noticed unless it was pointed out. But Sloane noticed everything that had been intentionally altered. Beatrice, when asked indirectly about household adjustments, smiled politely and said, "I just like things clean." Clean was not the correct word. Clean implied removal of dirt. This was removal of identity markers. That evening, Kieran spent more time than usual with Beatrice, showing her parts of the house, explaining how certain furniture pieces had been restored. Beatrice listened attentively, asking occasional questions that seemed harmless on the surface. But Sloane noticed something else. Beatrice was studying Kieran's emotional responsiveness more than the furniture itself. "How long did this take?" Beatrice asked, touching the edge of a wooden chair. 3 months, Kieran replied. "That's a long time to fix something broken," she said quietly. The sentence hung in the air slightly longer than necessary. Sloane caught it immediately, not because it was aggressive, but because it reframed restoration as fixation. It was a subtle reframing of Kieran's identity. Kieran didn't respond beyond a small nod, but Sloane saw the shift in his expression, a brief moment of introspection triggered without him realizing it. That was the beginning of the second layer of Beatrice's influence. It was not just environmental, it was cognitive. Later that night, Sloane found her bathroom reorganized again. Her personal items were still there, but their positions had been changed with precision. Toothbrush slightly rotated. Skincare moved closer to the sink edge. Nothing missing. Everything reinterpreted. It would have been easy to dismiss it as teenage curiosity if it were not so consistent. Downstairs, Beatrice sat alone in the living room, playing records. Kieran had gone to the workshop. The house felt divided into silent zones, each occupied but no longer shared. Sloane entered the room without announcing herself. Beatrice did not look up immediately. "You've been rearranging things," Sloane said. Beatrice finally turned her head. "I didn't think it mattered." "It matters if it's not yours." A pause. Not defensive. Observational. "I didn't mean anything by it," Beatrice said softly. But Sloane understood the structure beneath the sentence. Intentional ambiguity. Emotional deflection. No ownership of action, no ground for accusation. Kieran entered the room at that moment, sensing tension but not understanding its full shape. "What's going on?" he asked. Sloane looked at him briefly, then at Beatrice. "Nothing," Beatrice said before Sloane could respond. "We were just talking." And just like that, the narrative was already being rewritten. Kieran accepted it too quickly, because he wanted stability more than analysis. Sloane noticed that too. That night, lying in bed beside Kieran, she understood something with uncomfortable clarity. Beatrice was not acting randomly. Every small alteration had direction. Every adjustment tested a boundary. And the most dangerous part was not the manipulation itself. It was how natural it felt when no one stopped it early enough. The shift did not announce itself. It settled into their routine the way pressure builds in a sealed room. Quietly, gradually, until breathing itself feels different. By the 4th night, the house no longer belonged to a shared rhythm. It had been divided into priorities, and those priorities no longer aligned. It started with a sound. A soft knock on the bedroom door, barely loud enough to wake someone who wasn't already close to the surface. Sloane opened her eyes first. She didn't move immediately. She listened. The second knock came with a slight tremor, controlled but intentional. Kieran stirred beside her. "Dad," Beatrice's voice. Thin, strained, but not chaotic. It was too measured to be pure panic. Kieran sat up instantly. "B, I can't breathe." He was out of bed before Sloane could say anything. The reaction was automatic, instinctive, wired deeper than any adult relationship. Sloane stayed still for a moment longer, tracking the timing, the tone, the sequence. Not random. Constructed. By the time she reached the hallway, Kieran was already inside Beatrice's room, sitting on the edge of her bed. Beatrice was curled slightly inward, her breathing uneven but not uncontrolled. Her hands were clenched, but not trembling enough to indicate a full panic response. "It's okay," Kieran said quietly. "You're okay." Beatrice shook her head faintly. "It feels like before." Before. A reference point. A history marker. Something Sloane did not have access to. Kieran softened immediately. "I'm here. Just breathe with me." Sloane leaned against the doorframe, watching without interrupting. She had covered enough trauma cases to recognize real panic attacks. This was different. The structure was right, but the intensity was calibrated. Beatrice's eyes flicked toward Sloane for a fraction of a second, then back to Kieran. That glance was not accidental. It was confirmation. Sloane said nothing. She returned to the bedroom alone. Kieran stayed there for over an hour. When he came back, his expression was tired but focused, like someone who had just re-entered an old role he thought he had left behind. "She used to have panic attacks after the divorce," he said quietly, lying back down. "I didn't realize they were still happening." Sloane turned her head slightly toward him. "How often?" "I don't know. Not like this. Not like this." Another undefined variable. Sloane didn't argue. Not because she agreed, but because the situation had already shifted into a space where logic would sound like cruelty. She understood that too well. The next night, it happened again. This time, earlier. The same knock. The same voice. The same pattern. Kieran didn't hesitate. He didn't even look at Sloane before getting up. By the third night, there was no knock. Just a soft call from the hallway. "Dad." The door opened before the second syllable. Sloane remained in bed, staring at the ceiling. She was not angry. Not yet. What she felt was displacement. A slow, precise removal from a position she had occupied without question. During the day, Beatrice was quiet, composed, almost invisible. She followed routines, responded politely, never escalated anything openly. But Sloane began to notice how she positioned herself around Kieran. Always within reach. Always just inside his field of attention. If he moved to the kitchen, she appeared minutes later with a neutral question. If he went to the workshop, she found a reason to observe. If he sat down, she adjusted her position to remain within his peripheral awareness. It was not attachment. It was control of proximity. That evening, Sloane tried to reset something. She initiated closeness deliberately, not emotionally, but structurally. Sitting closer to Kieran on the couch, touching his arm while speaking, creating the kind of physical continuity they had always shared without thinking. Beatrice noticed. She did not react immediately. She waited. Then, quietly, she stood up and left the room. 10 minutes later, the first sign appeared. A glass dropped in the kitchen. Not shattered, but loud enough to trigger attention. Kieran stood up instantly. "B, I'm fine," Beatrice said from the kitchen, her voice slightly unsteady. Sloane remained seated. She knew what would happen next. Kieran moved toward the sound anyway. By the time Sloane entered the kitchen, Beatrice was standing near the counter, one hand resting lightly against it, her breathing uneven again. "I just got dizzy," she said softly. Kieran was already beside her. Sloane watched the scene unfold with growing clarity. The pattern was no longer subtle. It was iterative. Each event built on the previous one, reinforcing a new hierarchy of attention. That night, when they returned to bed, Sloane didn't initiate conversation. Kieran did. "She's still fragile," he said. Sloane turned toward him slightly. "She's precise." Kieran frowned faintly. "What does that mean?" "It means nothing she does is random." The silence that followed was not empty. It was resistant. "You think she's faking it?" he asked. "No," Sloane said calmly. "I think she's choosing when it happens." Kieran exhaled slowly, tension forming in his posture. "She's 16. And observant. That's not the same as manipulative. Sloane held his gaze. It can be. The distance between them that night was not physical. It was interpretive. Kieran chose empathy. Sloane chose analysis. Beatrice, upstairs, had already accounted for both. Over the next few days, the pattern intensified. The timing of her episodes became more strategic. Always when Sloane and Kieran were alone. Always when the atmosphere between them began to shift toward intimacy. Sloane stopped reacting outwardly. She adapted instead. She began to map the occurrences, noting timing, duration, triggers. It was the same approach she used in investigations. Build a pattern before confronting it. But this was not a case. It was her home. And the most unsettling realization came not from Beatrice's behavior, but from Kieran's gradual adjustment to it. He no longer questioned the interruptions. He anticipated them. And in doing so, he began to reorganize his priorities without realizing it. One night, as Sloane lay awake alone again, she understood something with absolute clarity. This was not jealousy in the conventional sense. It was something far more controlled. Beatrice was not competing for affection. She was restructuring access, and she was doing it with surgical precision. By the time the fourth phase began, the house no longer felt like a shared space. It felt segmented, like different emotional jurisdictions layered over the same physical structure. Everyone still lived there, but not in the same version of reality. Beatrice had learned something important. Direct confrontation created resistance. Subtle redirection created confusion. But controlled perception, that was irreversible if timed correctly. She chose the kitchen. It happened in the middle of an ordinary evening. Kieran was in the workshop downstairs. Sloane was reviewing notes at the dining table, and Beatrice moved between rooms with the quiet predictability she had perfected. Nothing about her behavior suggested escalation. That was always the most dangerous part. Sloane noticed her first when she entered the kitchen without sound, standing just within visual range, but not engaging directly. Beatrice was holding a glass of water, her posture relaxed, almost absent-minded. "You okay?" Sloane asked without looking up from her notes. Beatrice nodded. "Yes." Short answer. Stable tone. No trigger indicators. Sloane returned to her work. That was the opening. Beatrice placed the glass on the counter slightly harder than necessary. Not enough to be alarming. Just enough to be registered. Then she sighed. It was small. Almost invisible. But it carried weight. Sloane looked up this time. Beatrice was now leaning slightly against the counter, one hand pressing lightly into it, as if grounding herself. "I think I feel dizzy again," she said softly. The timing was precise. Not when Kieran was far away. Not when Sloane was alone with him. But in the narrow overlap window where Kieran was nearby enough to respond quickly, and Sloane was present enough to be seen as witness. Sloane understood immediately that this was not about the symptom. It was about positioning. Before Sloane could respond, Beatrice's breathing shifted, slightly uneven, controlled enough to remain believable, unstable enough to require attention. Sloane stood up slowly. "Sit down." Beatrice didn't look at her. "I'm fine." That phrase again. A refusal disguised as reassurance. Sloane stepped closer. "You're not fine. Sit." At that exact moment, footsteps came from the stairs. Kieran. He entered the kitchen and immediately locked onto Beatrice. The shift in his attention was instantaneous, reflexive. "What's going on?" he asked. Beatrice did not answer him immediately. Instead, she looked at Sloane, just for a fraction of a second. And that was enough. Because in that glance, Sloane saw the structure behind the scene. If she intervened too harshly, she would appear controlling. If she stayed silent, she would appear indifferent. If Kieran interpreted urgency through Beatrice alone, Sloane would become secondary witness in her own home. Beatrice finally spoke, softer now. "I just got dizzy." "It's nothing." But she did not move away from the counter. She remained exactly where she was, visible, vulnerable, and framed by both of them. Kieran stepped forward immediately. "Come here." He guided her gently toward a chair, his focus narrowing entirely onto her condition. Sloane remained standing, watching the sequence complete itself. Beatrice sat down, her breathing slowly stabilizing. Her expression softened into something that resembled relief. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Kieran shook his head. "Don't apologize." And that was the fracture point. Because Sloane saw it clearly now. The apology was not for weakness. It was for successful execution. Later that night, Sloane confronted the pattern again, not emotionally, but structurally. You noticed the timing? She asked quietly when they were alone in the bedroom. Kieran exhaled. She's struggling, Sloane. That's not the question. He turned toward her. Then what is? Why it only happens when I'm here. Silence. Not denial. Not agreement. Processing. Kieran looked away first. That's not true. It was not said with conviction. It was said with need. Sloane didn't push further. Not because she conceded, but because pushing now would collapse the remaining neutrality between them. Downstairs, Beatrice sat in her room, listening to music through the vinyl player. But she was not relaxing. She was recalibrating. Because the kitchen had worked. The emotional alignment had shifted exactly as intended. Kieran's protective instinct had been redirected without force. Sloane's analytical suspicion had been isolated without proof. And the system, the household, had responded predictably. That night, Beatrice wrote something in a small notebook she kept hidden inside a drawer. Not a diary. A record. 3 columns. Trigger. Response. Outcome. She added a new line. Kitchen intervention. Successful. Upstairs, Kieran lay awake beside Sloane, silent and unsettled, unable to name the discomfort forming in him. And Sloane, staring into the dark ceiling, understood something she had not yet said aloud. Beatrice was not reacting to the household. She was directing it. And she was becoming better at it every day. By the time Beatrice started altering objects, the emotional damage had already taken root. The house was no longer reacting to her presence. It was adapting to her absences, her interruptions, her carefully placed inconsistencies. Control had shifted from visible actions to invisible doubt. The first incident seemed trivial. Kieran couldn't find his keys. It was early morning, the kind of routine chaos that normally dissolves itself within minutes. He checked the counter, the workshop, the hallway table. Nothing. Sloane noticed immediately that his search pattern was becoming more frantic than necessary for something so small. Beatrice was already in the kitchen, eating breakfast slowly, observing without offering help. I had them last night, Kieran muttered. Sloane looked up from her coffee. Where did you put them? I always put them in the bowl. They were not in the bowl. 10 minutes later, Sloane found them in the laundry basket. Not hidden deeply, not concealed, just misplaced enough to feel accidental. When she placed them back on the counter, Beatrice glanced at them briefly, then returned to her food without comment. No reaction, no curiosity, no surprise. That absence of response mattered more than the act itself. 2 days later, Sloane's medication for migraines was not where she left it. She remembered clearly placing it in the bathroom cabinet. It was gone, then reappeared in the drawer under the sink. Kieran noticed her frustration. You're forgetting things lately, he said gently. That sentence landed exactly where it was intended. Sloane paused. I am not forgetting. He frowned slightly. It's just the keys, the meds. I am not forgetting, she repeated, more controlled this time. Beatrice, passing through the hallway, stopped for half a second, just long enough to register the exchange, then continued upstairs. No involvement, no fingerprints, but the pattern was already forming in perception. Later that night, Sloane began checking everything twice. Not out of paranoia, out of verification. She started documenting placements, times, positions. It was not emotional. It was procedural. But procedure has a cost. It changes how trust is allocated. Kieran began noticing her behavior. You're tracking things, he said once while watching her write notes. I'm observing inconsistencies. Or you're overthinking them. That was the shift Beatrice needed. Not accusation. Interpretation. Because once doubt is introduced into credibility, it does not need reinforcement. It reproduces itself. The next stage escalated quietly. Kieran's reading glasses disappeared, then reappeared in his jacket pocket, then were found in Beatrice's room, placed neatly on her desk. When Sloane brought it up, Beatrice looked genuinely surprised. Oh, she said softly. I didn't know they were mine. It was phrased carefully. Not denial. Not confession. Just misdirection disguised as confusion. Kieran hesitated. Sloane noticed that hesitation. It was the first time his certainty about Beatrice's behavior did not resolve immediately into clarity. That was the real victory, not the object placement, the delay in judgment. That evening, Sloane confronted Beatrice directly in the hallway. You're moving things, she said. Beatrice tilted her head slightly. I think you might be mistaken. No, Sloane replied. I'm not. A pause. Measured. Controlled. Beatrice's expression softened. I don't want you to feel stressed. That sentence reframed everything. Now Sloane was not observing a behavior. She was being described as unstable. Kieran appeared behind them at the wrong moment, or the perfect one, depending on perspective. What's happening? He asked. Sloane turned slightly. She's moving your things and denying it. Beatrice spoke before Kieran could respond. I think Sloane is just overwhelmed with work. There it was. Not confrontation. Reframing. Kieran looked between them, tension building in his face. Sloane, is that true? The question itself was the outcome, because now the burden of proof was not on Beatrice. It was on Sloane's perception, and perception, once questioned, becomes fragile. That night, the distance between Sloane and Kieran widened again. Not through conflict, through uncertainty. Beatrice did not celebrate. She did not need to. Instead, she returned to her room and updated her notebook. Keys, confirmed displacement cycle. Medication, successful credibility erosion. Glasses, trust interference established. She closed the notebook slowly. The system was responding exactly as expected. Downstairs, Sloane sat in silence longer than usual, realizing something she did not want to admit even internally. This was no longer about objects. It was about ownership of reality inside the same space. And Beatrice was winning that negotiation without ever raising her voice. Beatrice did not need to destroy Sloane directly anymore. She only needed to change how others perceived her. Once perception shifts outward, the target begins to carry the damage inward without additional pressure. The opportunity came naturally, a small gathering. Kieran had invited a few close friends over. Nothing formal. Just wine, conversation, the kind of evening meant to reset tension rather than create it. Sloane understood it as an attempt to stabilize the household narrative externally. If everything looked normal from the outside, maybe it would begin to feel normal again inside. Beatrice prepared differently. She chose simplicity, neutral clothes, soft expression, minimal presence. She entered the living room only when everyone had already settled, as if she was not part of the structure but something temporarily passing through it. The guests reacted to her immediately. There is a specific kind of attention adults give to visibly quiet teenagers. Protective, softened, preloaded with assumptions. Beatrice leaned into that without forcing it. She answered questions politely, smiled at the right moments, kept her tone gentle and slightly withdrawn. Sloane noticed the shift within minutes. Beatrice was not competing for attention. She was assigning emotional roles. When someone asked about her life in England, Beatrice lowered her gaze slightly before answering. It was okay, she said quietly. Mostly I stayed with my grandmother. A pause. Not dramatic. Just timed. And my dad was busy here, she added, almost as an afterthought. That sentence changed the room's temperature. Kieran instinctively leaned forward. But she continued before he could interrupt. It was hard sometimes. After the divorce. Not accusation. Just framing. Sloane did not react immediately. She waited. Because she understood what was happening. This was not storytelling. It was calibration of sympathy. One of the guests turned toward Sloane. So you all live together now? The woman asked lightly. Sloane nodded. Yes. Beatrice looked down at her hands, then spoke softly. It's better now. Not for everyone. Just better. The implication was enough. Sloane felt the shift before she saw it fully reflected. The guests were no longer neutral observers. They were beginning to assign emotional weight distribution. Father, daughter, and the stepmother occupying an undefined space that required interpretation. Beatrice never directly attacked her. She simply ensured she was not defended. Later in the evening, when Sloane stepped into the kitchen to refill her glass, she overheard fragments of conversation from the living room. She seems sweet, one voice said. Yeah, but you can tell she's been through a lot, another replied. She's adjusting, I guess. No one mentioned Sloane explicitly. That was the point. She was becoming an unspoken variable. When she returned, Beatrice was sitting slightly closer to Kieran now, her posture relaxed, almost naturally aligned with him. She was not touching him, not overtly seeking contact, but her spatial positioning made them visually coherent, a father and daughter unit within a social frame. Sloane stood slightly apart, not excluded, just unanchored. At one point, Beatrice excused herself politely and left the room. Immediately, the conversation softened further around her absence. She seems fragile, one guest said quietly. Kieran nodded. She's had a rough time. Sloane listened without interruption. No one asked her for interpretation. That was new. After the guests left, the house felt louder than before, despite being empty. Silence now carried residue. Kieran helped clean up in the kitchen. Beatrice had already gone upstairs. Sloane stacked glasses slowly, watching him. They like her, she said eventually. Kieran didn't look at her immediately. She's trying. That's not what I'm talking about. He paused. Then what are you talking about? Sloane hesitated only briefly. They don't know me anymore. That sentence stayed between them longer than anything else that night. Because it wasn't a complaint. It was a measurement. Upstairs, Beatrice sat on her bed, listening through faint sounds of movement below. She did not need to hear the words clearly. She only needed to sense the outcome. External validation had shifted. Sloane was no longer just being questioned inside the home. She was being reinterpreted outside it. Beatrice opened her notebook again. Social calibration, successful. Isolation vector, active. She closed it. The system was now self-reinforcing. And the most dangerous part was that no single action could be identified as the cause anymore. Only the result remained visible. And by then, it was already too late to undo cleanly. Sloane found it by accident, but she did not believe in accidents anymore. It was late afternoon, the house unusually quiet. Kieran was in the workshop downstairs, Beatrice supposedly in her room. Sloane was organizing a storage drawer in the hallway, not because it needed cleaning, but because she needed a controlled task to anchor her attention. Small systems, predictable outcomes. The drawer stuck slightly when she pulled it open. Inside were ordinary things at first: spare batteries, old receipts, loose keys that didn't belong to anyone immediately. But underneath a folded cloth, she found a small notebook. Not hidden aggressively, not disguised, just placed where it would not be found during routine interaction. That alone was enough to make her pause. She didn't open it immediately. She looked around first. Then she did. The pages were not emotional. They were structured. Clean handwriting. Lists. Categories. At first, it looked like organization, maybe anxiety-driven cataloging. But the longer she read, the more the pattern shifted from harmless structure to intentional mapping. Names appeared. Kieran. Sloane. Event. Kieran exhaled. Sloane. It's not a diary, she continued. It's documentation. She's been tracking everything. Responses, timing, outcomes. He shook his head slightly, as if trying to reject the framing before it settled. She's 16. That doesn't change what I read. She wouldn't. She did. A pause. The first real fracture in his certainty. Kieran looked away. Maybe you misunderstood it. That sentence landed exactly as Beatrice would have designed it if she were present. Sloane noticed that immediately. I didn't misunderstand structure, she said quietly. Kieran's voice lowered. You're saying she's manipulating us. I'm saying she's studying us. That distinction mattered to him. It softened the accusation into something less digestible but harder to dismiss. He didn't respond immediately. Upstairs, Beatrice listened. Not to the words. To the silence between them. Because silence after discovery was the most important phase. It determined whether the system would fracture or adapt. Kieran finally spoke. I need to talk to her. Sloane nodded once. Yes. But internally, she already understood something else. Confrontation was not the endpoint of Beatrice's system. It was part of it. Because once the notebook was discovered, every reaction afterward would also become data. After the notebook, the house stopped feeling like it was being lived in and started feeling like it was being evaluated in real time. Nothing changed outwardly at first. Beatrice still ate breakfast, still answered politely, still moved through rooms with the same controlled calm. But now every action carried a second layer, awareness that she had been partially exposed, and calculation of how the exposure would reshape responses. Sloane noticed it immediately. Beatrice was no longer only observing the system. She was testing its reaction to being seen. The escalation came 3 nights later. It began with silence. Beatrice did not come down for dinner. At first, Kieran assumed she was resting. Sloane didn't assume anything. She waited for the pattern. There was always a pattern. At 9:17 p.m., Kieran checked her room. It was empty. Not chaotic. Not disturbed. Empty in a deliberate way. The window was slightly open. On the bed, a folded note. Kieran picked it up first. Sloane saw his expression change before he even spoke. What is it? She asked. He didn't answer immediately. Then he read it out loud. voice tightening slightly as he went. I can't stay where I'm not believed. I'm sorry. I just need space. Silence. Sloane didn't move. Because the structure was already clear. This was not disappearance. This was positioning. Kieran was already grabbing his phone. I'm calling her. Sloane stepped closer. Wait. He looked at her sharply. She's gone, Sloane. No, she said calmly. She's not gone. She's staging absence. That sentence hit differently. Not emotional denial. Interpretation of strategy. But Kieran was already beyond that layer. He left the room, phone in hand. Within minutes, the situation expanded outward. Calls, messages, anxiety multiplying through limited information. Friends were contacted. Possibilities escalated quickly from runaway to danger. Sloane remained in the house. She didn't join the search immediately, because she understood something important. If Beatrice had chosen disappearance, she had chosen visibility of consequence. And consequence always had direction. At 11:04 p.m., police were notified. By 11:37 p.m., the house was a command center of controlled panic. Kieran was pacing. She wouldn't just leave like this. Sloane stayed near the edge of the room. She would if she wanted you to act. He turned toward her. Act? Yes. He stared at her. You think this is what? Manipulation again? Sloane didn't hesitate. I think it's escalation. That word changed the temperature. Because escalation implied intent beyond emotion. It implied design. Outside, headlights passed slowly along the street. The world continuing normally around a contained emergency. Then, at 12:12 a.m., the call came. A neighbor. They had seen someone sitting near the old riverside path, not far from the bridge. Kieran was out the door immediately. Sloane followed. The air outside was cold, sharp, grounding. When they arrived, Beatrice was there. Sitting. Not panicked. Not lost. Composed. Her knees drawn slightly up, arms wrapped loosely around them, like someone waiting rather than someone rescued. Kieran rushed forward. B. She looked up at him slowly. Relief entered his expression instantly. But Sloane saw something else first. No distress markers. No adrenaline response. No chaotic emotional residue that would typically follow disappearance. Only controlled stillness. Beatrice stood up as Kieran reached her. He pulled her into a tight embrace. She accepted it. Did not resist. Did not cling. Just accepted. I'm sorry, she whispered. Kieran held her tighter. Don't do that again. I didn't mean to scare you. But she had. And that mattered. Sloane stood slightly behind them, watching the interaction complete itself. When Beatrice finally looked at her, it was brief. Not hostility. Assessment. Then neutrality returned. On the walk back, Kieran stayed close to Beatrice, physically protective, emotionally re-centered around her presence. Sloane walked slightly apart. Not excluded. Repositioned. Inside the house again, everything softened into forced calm. But Sloane understood what had actually happened. This was not escape. It was proof delivery. Beatrice had forced a full system response. Kieran's fear had been activated at maximum intensity. External authorities had been involved. Sloane's interpretation had been publicly questioned. And Beatrice had returned not as someone who needed to be controlled, but as someone who had just demonstrated how much control she already had. Kieran remained silent, but Sloane noticed him glancing at Beatrice's jacket. It was dry. Despite her sitting by the river where the grass was heavy with evening mist, there wasn't a single damp patch or a trace of the wild environment on her clothes. It was a small detail, but it lodged in his mind like a splinter. That night, Sloane didn't sleep, because she understood the real message behind the disappearance. If you question me, I can make reality reorganize itself around the question. And for the first time since Beatrice arrived, the house did not feel like it was being observed. It felt like it was being tested under pressure until something finally gave way. Sloane didn't try to argue with Kieran the next morning. That was the first change. Not because she accepted the situation, but because she understood something structural. Direct confrontation was no longer a stable channel. Every time she named Beatrice's behavior, it didn't land as information anymore. It landed as division. And division was exactly what Beatrice had been engineering from the beginning. The house had entered a new phase. Not escalation. Containment. Kieran moved differently now. More cautious with Beatrice, more attentive, more emotionally responsive. The disappearance had reset his baseline. He no longer treated her behavior as something to analyze. He treated it as something to stabilize. Beatrice adapted instantly. She became softer, not more vulnerable, more efficient. She thanked him more often, asked fewer ambiguous questions, stayed closer during shared spaces without appearing to seek it. The panic episodes stopped completely, not reduced. Stopped. Sloane noticed that first. Absence of a pattern was still a pattern. That realization shifted her strategy. If Beatrice was controlling emotional distribution, then emotional confrontation would always be absorbed and redirected. So Sloane stopped engaging on emotional ground entirely. She began observing only mechanics, timing, consistency, reaction lag, who responded first to stimuli, who deferred. The system was now visible in structure rather than narrative. And in structure, Beatrice was still leading. But something had changed after the river incident. Beatrice was no longer expanding control aggressively. She was maintaining it. That distinction mattered. Maintenance meant risk exposure had increased, which meant she had been forced to stabilize her system rather than evolve it. Sloane confirmed this over the next few days through small inconsistencies. Beatrice checked Kieran's attention more frequently now, not emotionally, logistically. Short pauses before speaking when Sloane was present. Slight recalibration of tone depending on proximity. The system was still active, but now it required monitoring, which meant it could be disrupted. Sloane started testing boundaries quietly, not with accusations, with controlled absence. She stopped participating in conversations where Beatrice was central, not withdrawing emotionally, just removing herself as a reactive node. The effect was immediate. Kieran noticed first. "You've been quiet," he said one evening. "I'm listening," Sloane replied. But she wasn't listening to them. She was listening to the structure. Beatrice adapted again. She began speaking slightly more when Sloane was present. Not directly to her, but in shared space. Maintaining visibility. Maintaining relevance. Sloane understood the logic. If she could not be removed, she had to be integrated into a stable equilibrium where she could not dominate perception. But integration required symmetry. And Beatrice had never built symmetry, only direction. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A simple moment. Kieran asked Beatrice a question about school plans. Beatrice answered, then paused, and added, almost casually, "I think Sloane is working too much lately." Not accusation. Observation framed as concern. Kieran turned slightly towards Sloane. "Are you?" It was a small moment, but structurally perfect, because it redirected evaluation back onto Sloane without Beatrice needing to initiate confrontation. Sloane met Beatrice's eyes briefly. Not long, just long enough to register intent. Then she answered Kieran calmly, "I'm working normally." Beatrice smiled slightly, not visibly, internally contained, because it had worked. Again, that night, Sloane changed something, not in behavior, in access. She checked the household logs she had quietly started maintaining since the notebook discovery, times, movements, interactions, not to accuse, to map. And one pattern stood out clearly now. Beatrice never acted when Sloane was fully absent. She acted when Kieran's attention could be redirected between two stable anchors. She required triangulation. Sloane closed the file. For the first time, she understood the real constraint in Beatrice's system. It was not power over Kieran. It was dependence on relational structure to exist at all. Without Sloane as counterweight, Beatrice lost leverage. Without Beatrice, Sloane was simply partner. The system only functioned as a three-point tension model, and that meant something important. It could be collapsed, not by force, but by removing the triangle. After Sloane identified the triangle, she stopped treating the situation as conflict and started treating it as architecture. Nothing visible changed at first. The house still functioned the same way. Meals, conversations, routines that pretended to be normal. But the internal dynamics had already begun to shift because Sloane had removed herself from the emotional role Beatrice depended on. She stopped competing. She stopped reacting. She stopped filling the space Beatrice needed to define herself against. At first, Beatrice adjusted as expected. She increased subtle engagement with Kieran. More shared moments. More quiet alignment. She positioned herself closer in conversations, slightly more present in daily rhythm. But something was missing now, friction. The resistance that allowed her influence to have shape. Without resistance, her actions stopped producing clear directional outcomes. Kieran noticed something he couldn't articulate. "She's calmer," he said one evening. Sloane nodded. "Yes, but it feels different." Sloane didn't answer. Because it was different. Calm without opposition is not resolution. It is recalibration. Beatrice was no longer escalating, but she was also no longer advancing. Her system had stabilized at maximum safe output. Any further push risked exposure. And Sloane had stopped providing the hidden tension point that made escalation useful. The household began to flatten. Not peacefully. Structurally. Kieran found himself no longer pulled between interpretations. The emotional pressure that had previously forced constant micro-decisions began to dissolve. For the first time in weeks, his attention stopped being divided in unstable directions. Beatrice noticed. She adapted again. But this time, adaptation required something she hadn't needed before. Direct visibility. One evening, she sat at the kitchen table while Kieran and Sloane were both present. The silence between all three of them was no longer tense. It was neutral. Beatrice spoke without preface. I think things are better now. Kieran looked at her. Better how? She paused. Not for effect. For recalculation. Less confusing, she said. Sloane finally looked up from her cup. That word mattered. Confusing had been the system's fuel. Kieran nodded slowly. That's good. But Sloane understood the real meaning. Beatrice was acknowledging loss of control surface. Because without triangulation, she no longer had multiple emotional vectors to manipulate. Only direct interaction remained. And direct interaction was predictable, which meant it could be contained. Over the next days, Beatrice attempted minor reintroductions of previous patterns. Slight emotional cues. Small timing shifts. But they no longer produced the same reactions. Kieran was more stable now. Less reactive. Less easily redirected. Sloane did not intervene. She did not expose. She simply maintained absence of reinforcement. And slowly, Beatrice's system stopped receiving feedback loops that once validated her structure. The notebook remained exactly where Sloane had left it, hidden under the folded cloth, a dormant blueprint of a machine that had run out of fuel. Not because it was hidden, but because it was no longer useful. One evening, Kieran sat outside on the small terrace, watching the city light fade. Beatrice was upstairs. Sloane joined him quietly. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Kieran said, I feel like something shifted. Sloane nodded. It did. He looked at her. Was it her? Or us? He didn't wait for her answer because he had already seen it. An hour earlier, he had passed Beatrice's room and caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. She hadn't seen him. She had been sitting at her desk, perfectly still, erasing a line in her notebook with a mechanical, emotionless precision that looked nothing like the fragile daughter he had tried to rescue. It was the look of a craftsman finishing a job, and in that reflection, the daughter he knew had vanished. Sloane didn't answer immediately, because the honest answer was not simple. It was the structure, she said finally. Kieran exhaled slowly, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't look uncertain. Upstairs, Beatrice stood by her window, looking out at the same street. But this time, she wasn't tracking responses. She was observing absence of response. And that was the moment she understood something she had not accounted for. Control does not collapse when confronted. It collapses when it no longer produces reaction. Not conflict. Not resistance. Just silence where influence used to be. And in that silence, the system she built stopped evolving. It simply stopped working. The next morning, the notebook was gone from the drawer. Beatrice no longer tried to hide it, but she no longer wrote in it either. The empty pages became her silent surrender in a house that had stopped trying to solve her.